welcome back, Faithful Politics listeners and watchers. If you're watching us on our YouTube channel, I am your political host, Will Wright, and your faithful host, Pastor Josh Bertram, apparently is not with us today, but we have with us Carlos Lozada. He is an opinion columnist for the New York Times, co-host of the Matter of Opinion podcast. He has won the Pulitzer Prize for criticism and is the author of What Were We Thinking? A Brief Intellectual History of the Trump Era, and is now out with a new book called The Washington Book, where he explores how people in power reveal themselves through their books and writings, and in doing so illuminates the personal, political, and cultural conflicts driving Washington and the nation. So, Carlos, maybe you can start off by telling us what the inspiration was behind writing the Washington book.
Thank you. So about a year ago, I gave a journalism lecture at my alma mater, the University of Notre Dame, and the idea was to sort of explain how I do what I do. And I'd never really kind of looked back on my own work in that way before. Whenever I write something, I never look at it again because I always find a million things I wish I could have phrased slightly differently, and it becomes frustrating. But I'd been a book critic at the Washington Post for about 7 years, and for the last couple of years, I've been an opinion columnist at the New York Times. But what I've done in both those roles is mainly write about political books and attempt to understand politicians kind of in their own words. And so, for instance, when George H.W. Bush passed away, I sort of read all 4 of his books and tried to write kind of one big essay about what they said about him. I've done that with Donald Trump's books, with Barack Obama's books. And so kind of looking back at my own writing, which was, a weird experience, I realized that, there were certain kind of recurring approaches I had to try to understand politicians. Like reading their acknowledgement sections is always incredibly revealing. Finding the kind of like turns of phrase that they rely on, the rhetorical crutches that end up kind of revealing something about them. Is something that only when I kind of started reading everything I'd done, I realized, that's one of my sort of techniques. And so I wrote this speech, I delivered the speech, and I realized upon delivering it that it felt like the introduction to an essay collection. And so that is the introduction that you encounter at the beginning of the book, and that led me to then kind of sift through my work over the past decade and assemble a sort of a greatest hits of the essays and the book reviews that I think allowed me to really use books to understand politicians.
That's really cool. I mean, just kind of a fun fact question. Like, how many books have you read about politics?
Wow. I'm not entirely sure because I mean it sounds like like when people think you're a book critic, they or when they hear you're a book critic, they think like, oh, you must have read so much and have be some kind of intellectual. Like if it's just your job, it's what you get to do all day. It's like anyone else's job. And so when I get to read books all day and get paid to do it, you end up reading a lot. For the first book that you mentioned that I did on the Trump presidency, I read about 150 books that in some way dealt with the big debates of the Trump era. This book has the Washington book covers, I would say, a similar number, maybe like around 130, 140. But I should say I use the word book in a very elastic sense. So, special counsel investigations, right? Congressional reports, commission reports, Supreme Court opinions, which often are as lengthy as books. To me, those are all Washington books, right? Those all fit into this kind of broad category. It seems like a Washington book is something very narrow, but to my mind, I try to define it in as broad a manner as I can.
How this is just another sort of like, I don't know, inside baseball question, but
Sure.
like how fast can you read books? Because I mean, I'm like, I read a lot of books too, but like, I don't, it could be just because I've got kids. So like, I get distracted super easy. I mean, I can't just sit down, sip my coffee and just like enjoy a book. It's like, I sit down, sip my coffee, and then stop the kids from fighting, and then come back and then read the introduction and then like clean up a mess that they made. So like, how fast do you get
No,
through a book?
I suffer from the same malady. I have three young children, and they quite correctly occupy a huge part of my life. Um, the irony is that I'm not a quick reader, and when I'm reading for work, I'm actually much slower.
Hmm.
So for instance, if I'm going to read, say, Mike Pence's memoir, right, which I did, and I wrote about it for the New York Times, and it's my essay about it is in this book. Um, I will read it 3 times.
Hmm.
The first time I read it kind of straight through. That's the longest read. I read it with a pen. I make a million notes in the margins, underline things. I look up stuff in the footnotes. It's probably the most kind of aggressive and intense read. Um, then when I finish it, I try to set it aside for like either a few hours or a day or something, and I come back to it with a highlighter. You said you wanted inside baseball. I'm giving you
Yeah,
inside
yeah, yeah,
baseball.
man.
Yeah, so I'll grab a highlighter. I'll grab I've got dozens of little pink or yellow highlighters right here, and then I read it again, a little faster this time, and dwelling mainly on the places where I can tell I was really struck the first time, right? And so what is it that why did I write so many notes on this page? What's going on? And I try to do a little bit of a deeper read on those kinds of sections of the book. Um, and then when I finish that read, I open up a file on my computer and I go through the book a final time, and I start, almost doing like a subset of the subset, right? I find the things that were most intriguing, the things that are in highlighter,
Mhm.
um, and and they're quotes from the book. They're sort of ideas that I had. They're questions that I had, and I sort of just start writing all of it into the file, um, and then that file becomes the raw material for the essay I'm going to write. I almost never look at the book again until maybe the
Mhm.
very end. Um, and I only figured this out sort of recently, but it's about I would say it's about 1,000 words per 100 pages of the book. So say a book is like 400 pages, I might
Mhm.
have 4,000 words, or 5,000 words worth of just notes and ideas and questions and quotes.
Mhm.
And that becomes kind of the basis of then what I try to do, in the writing.
Mhm.
But it's totally different from reading for pleasure,
Mhm.
and like we have this annual 1 week at the beach trip, and I take novels and I take things, and just reading just a book through and not worrying about my notes or worrying about questions I want to ask is such a delight after spending kind of the rest of the year reading in this other way. But it also creates enormous pressure for me to decide which books to take to the beach because, my God, they can't just be so-so because what
Yeah,
a
yeah.
waste, right? I don't have that much time to read for pleasure. So throughout the year, I'm thinking like, will I take this one or that one? But it makes reading for pleasure that much more enjoyable.
Yeah, that's really awesome. And I'll be honest, I was asking some of these questions kind of from sort of a selfish point of view because I read a lot of books. Publishers are great. We love all the publishers that send us books.
Yep.
Um, we do the podcast as a bit of a hobby, kind of fun, but we are very selective on the books that we choose to have sent to us, and we
Ah,
always
right.
feel like an obligation to actually like read the book because like if we're gonna have somebody on our show, to talk about the book, I don't want to just like try to fake it till I make it kind of thing, and be like,
Yes.
so tell me what's in the book,
Right.
and so if I could glean some tips and tricks from people that do this from a living, I'm definitely going to tap into that. But I want want to change gears a little bit and just talk about kind of the structure of the book, and then we'll kind of dig into some of the content. But you alluded a little bit to it earlier that the book isn't just like a compilation of essays about other people's books, but it's about other sort of like long, huge pieces of text, documents, what have you. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So many of the books are, my reviews or essays on books by politicians and kind of how they express themselves, and how they end up revealing themselves, whether they mean to or not. But I try to think of texts more expansively. Like I've been a Washington journalist for 25 years, but I've never like chased some congressman like through the halls of the Capitol. I've never yelled out questions at a press conference. I try to understand Washington as if it were one kind of big text to be decoded. And so, for instance, when the Supreme Court issued its ruling on the Dobbs decision, which overturned Roe v. Wade, I decided that I would look back at the original Roe decision, at the Casey versus Planned Parenthood decision from 1992, and Dobbs, from 2022, and try to see sort of what connective tissue there was among the three of them, how they looked at history, how they looked at law, at the rights of women, and so I stitched those three together, right, in a piece that's one of the chapters in this book. And what I found there is that, the politicizing of the court, which a lot of people worry about these days, really is evident in the evolution of the majority opinions and the dissents in Roe, Casey, and Dobbs, right? And, for me, that was, reading the three of them together felt like that should be a book, like how could you think of them in isolation of one another? But so for me, that's kind of the way I try to be creative and what constitutes a quote unquote Washington book. I did the same thing with three more recent texts, which were kind of the three major investigations of the Trump presidency. First, the Mueller report. Second, the congressional report on Trump and Ukraine. Remember the perfect phone call and all the rest. And finally, the January 6th report. And so what was interesting to me there was not just to see kind of like what each of them found or what each of them concluded, but almost how they spoke to each other. Mueller's report was more reticent. The other two seemed to kind of learn the lessons of the Mueller report, and they were more aggressive. But to me, like, it's impossible to think of any one of those three without thinking of the two others.
That's that's really interesting, because I was thinking about the Mueller report in particular, like the 434 pages or whatever the number was.
447, I think.
Yeah, yeah. And
don't quote me, but I think that's it. Yeah.
Well, 400 plus pages of the Mueller report, and I understand people have busy lives, and nobody's really going to read the Mueller report unless like you are either in the journalist business or you have a podcast where you're sort of the political kind of like expert. Like I read the Mueller report 2 times and listened to it on Audible. Because,
oh wow, okay.
Because after
you are devoted. That's great.
I really am, actually. It's really funny. Like I was talking to a guest of ours. Just we were talking about, what were we talking about? Like a recent Trump report that came out. Gosh, now I'm drawing a blank. Oh no, it was the Biden report about the classified documents.
Yes.
And the person I was speaking to was like an ex general counsel for the CIA, for like Michael Hayden. We were just sort of like unpacking a little bit, and I mentioned something to him about something in the executive summary, and he's like, "Yeah, of course, like that's probably all that you read, right?" And I was like, "No, I read like all 338 pages, like I was like, because this stuff's interesting to me,
yeah,
and I just want to have the facts, so." anyways, I digress. But like
But
I
even reading the executive summary is a lot more than most people are going to do, right? Which is
yeah,
great. Yeah.
yeah, which I really wish more people would just read source documents. I mean, oh my gosh, I mean that's I'll get off my soapbox there for a second, um, but you know when it comes to like reading, summarizing these major documents, like how do you read them and then write about them without like letting kind of your own personal biases,
Hmm.
you know, get in the way about like how you write it? And I guess the same thing can probably be said about even like some of these memoirs or, you know, these
Yeah.
campaign books or whatnot.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I think about it from the point of view of the reader, and is or the reader. I don't mean of these documents, but of whatever I am going to write about them, right? And am I, as a reader, more interested in what this random guy thinks about the thing and how it fits, how it aligns with his politics?
Mm-hmm.
Or am I more interested in kind of what he discovers in the document about, what the author was attempting to do, right? And for me, the answer is easy. Like, I care far more about what a journalist knows than what a
Mm-hmm.
journalist thinks, right?
Yeah.
And so, I um I have my own sort of political convictions that probably don't align very neatly in a particular camp. I'm a little bit homeless in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but so what I try to do when I read these books or these documents is just find those little moments of revelation where, regardless of my politics, there is a compelling insight there, and it might, like, it can be a single sentence. It can be a word, right? In the January 6th committee report, like, my favorite moment is when it describes Cassidy Hutchinson's testimony. Um, and she is the former White House aide, who on January 6th was there, like, at the ellipse where Trump was giving the speech, and she describes how Trump, wanted people to get through, into the area where he was giving the speech. He wanted a bigger crowd, and he wanted them to get rid of the metal detectors, right? Because he knew some of the people were armed, and that would keep them from coming in. And he said, I don't care. They're not here to hurt me, right? And if you think about that sentence, right, they're not here to hurt me. Um, if the emphasis is on one word versus another, it's a radically different sentence, right? They're not here to hurt me, right? Say the emphasis is on hurt, right?
Yeah.
Then it means they're here to cheer for me. They're here to support me, right? It's a kind of benign sentence, right? If the sentence was, they're not here to hurt me, then it's an incredibly sinister sentence, right? They're here to hurt somebody else,
Yeah.
right? Be it Mike Pence, be it the Capitol Police, like, whatever. And so, to me, that ambiguity was utterly fascinating, right? And so I went to the video to see how Cassidy Hutchinson had said it in her testimony. At one point in the book, in the report, the "me" is italicized. Another one, it's not. Like, it's, and so for me, it's picking up those little nuances to really understand what may have been going on. Um, that's the fascination here. And I think that readers will care much more about that kind of thing than they'll care about whether, like, I'm a liberal or a conservative, or I think Trump sucks, or I think he's great, or, like that. And so it's not a matter of, like, having to fight to hide my own instincts. It's much more a function of, like, well, what's actually going to be most interesting for someone to read.
Yeah. So Um, in full honesty, I've never once read a like political, like presidential campaign book
Hmm.
in my entire life. And I'd love to kind of get your take on, like, give us sort of a, I don't know, 30,000 foot view of like why these books are written,
Yeah.
number one. And then two, maybe we can kind of come down in elevation a little bit, and you can talk to us a little bit about how they inform, like what a candidate's presidency would look like. And then the last thing is, of the presidents that have written a campaign like type book,
Hmm.
how accurate is it when they're actually in the White House?
Oh, um, those are good questions. Sort of why do they, they exist in a kind of dutiful sense, right? There's a moment when, especially when a campaign seems to be wide open, a lot of possible candidates, they all come out with a book, right? Um, it's funny. I think Lindsey Graham very reluctantly wrote a book. I think it wasn't even. I think it was just an ebook. It didn't even exist as a physical product. And I think in the introduction he said something like, you know, when you want a big promotion like I want, you're supposed to do this. Like it's just like he was fully acknowledging that it was something he was coming into like not very excited. Um, and um, and so it's almost like a lottery, I think, for the publishers too, because you know who knows if that particular person is going to end up winning, right? Like no one's going to read like Tim Pawlenty's campaign memoir unless he
Yeah.
becomes the nominee, right? Small
Hmm.
chance that he was going to become the nominee, but if he had, that book would have become significant,
Yeah.
right? Um, and so, I think it's got that kind of lottery aspect to it, right? It's just one of the rituals of Washington politics that when you're running for office, this is what you do. Those tend to be, ghost-written books. Often you find that different candidates may have the same ghostwriter, which I find hilarious, um, because there's a small group of people who are very good at doing that sort of thing. Um, in general, I find that the closer a book is to in time to a campaign or to that person's presidency, the less interesting it is, right? So Barack Obama wrote 3 books, right? Dreams from My Father, The Audacity of Hope, and the first of, I think, 2 White House memoirs is a Promised Land. Um, Dreams from My Father, which was in the '90s, long ago, before anyone imagined Obama could be president. Um, by far the more interesting, the most interesting of the 3 books. Audacity of Hope, which comes out like I think he's running for Senate, or it's clear that he's kind of on his way to running for the presidency. Completely uninteresting, generic book, right? A Promised Land, probably somewhere in the middle. Um, you know, it's it's far more interesting to see presidents give an accounting um, of their presidencies after, even though those are very self-serving as well,
Yeah.
after they've been president, than when they're leading up to it. Um, I recently read Jimmy Carter's books. Well, I mean, he's got like 30 or more books. I read 4 of them that are in some way memoirs. Um, the least interesting ones were his campaign book right before the presidency and his sort of self-serving White House memoir right after. An extraordinary, a beautifully written book is called An Hour Before Daylight, which is a book about growing up on his father's farm in Georgia during the Depression. It's not just good like for a politician. It's a terrific book on its own. And so I always find that the more removed books are from a campaign or from service in the White House, the more interesting they tend to be. The kind of gold standard of political books or of presidents' books is supposed to be the personal memoirs of Ulysses Grant, which does not deal with his presidency at all. It's about the Civil War, the Mexican-American War, and that made it kind of remarkable. It didn't hurt that like Mark Twain helped him edit it. Will, I lost you for a moment.
How do the books stack up to say like, now they're in the White House?
Oh, yeah. That's hard to say. In part because what presidents think they're going to encounter in the White House is often so different from what they end up encountering once they're in power. And so it's almost like they're in different universes, right? Like books that books that kind of tell you what kind of leader I can be versus those that actually reveal, how they operated in the White House. I feel like you're just getting two entirely different versions of a human being. But that's interesting too. That's interesting as well. But I would say that the campaign book genre, the book that comes out during a primary or just before, tend not to be that useful. Although, for instance, Kamala Harris, right? Like when Joe Biden was going to announce who his vice presidential pick was going to be, people were thinking was going to be either Kamala Harris or Susan Rice, right? Susan Rice, who had served as the ambassador to the United Nations. And so I had I hadn't read their books, but I had both of them on my desk, ready to crash on one of them as soon as he announced a pick, and thank God he picked Kamala Harris because her book was a lot shorter. And so I could get through it more quick. That was my only rooting interest at the time. Susan Rice's book was far longer. And so I should read it at some point. But at this instance, I sort of crashed on reading Kamala Harris's book. And what I enjoyed about that is that there was one thing she kept saying in the book, and that's that she didn't believe in false choices, right? She would call out false choices. The false choice between protecting citizens and supporting the police. The false choice between the rights of undocumented immigrants and the rights of American citizens. And I get it, saying that you don't believe in false choices. It can come off very, very thoughtful and very sage, but I also felt it was a way to kind of not face hard decisions sometimes. Politics is all about hard choices. And so her repetitive use of that construction of false choices is the one thing I remember from that book, right? And it's kind of one of the lenses through which I look at her vice presidency. And so, that to me is one way in which kind of an early book, a book that could be construed as a quote unquote campaign book, while not terrific, has that one thing I can pull from it that then is a great lens to assess the politician once they're in high office.
Interesting. And in your book, and even here, you mentioned the term ghostwriter, and I think most Americans kind of have a general understanding of what a ghostwriter is. But I'd be interested to hear sort of your inside perspective on what is a ghostwriter? Is a ghostwriter just a person that writes a book for somebody else, or is there more kind of behind sort of a ghostwriter?
Yeah, I mean, in a very basic sense, yes, right. It's someone relatively unknown who writes a book for someone who is very well known, and maybe doesn't really have the time and or writing skills to pull it off, himself or herself. That said, there are many different ways to go about that, right? A kind of typical approach is to kind of interview the story out of the political figure, right? So say I'm gonna ghostwrite, the book for, some prominent politician. I would sit down with that person and conduct a series of just one-on-one interviews where they tell me about, their lives, and they tell me about, their challenges and dilemmas and their experiences. And I started sort of assembling the outlines of a story. And then we go back and forth on a series of drafts, and the politician will edit it, will add things, will change things, will point things out. And it's a collaborative process. You were talking about how you were reading the special counsel report in the Biden documents case. There was a chunk of it that had to do with the ghostwriting of Biden's book, Promise Me, Dad. About his final year as vice president, and also the year that Beau Biden passed away. And, a lot of people focused on the report because, did Biden, reveal classified material to the ghostwriter? And yes, that's very important. But for me, what was most interesting was to see what it revealed about their process, right? And if you read it that way, it's a whole different story. But for instance, one of the most famous books by a president of recent times is by long before he was president, is The Art of the Deal. And there, the ghostwriter was Tony Schwartz. Not entirely a ghost because he appeared on the cover, right? His name, it was Donald Trump with Tony Schwartz.
Yeah.
But there, he gave this long interview with the New Yorker, in 2016, I believe, describing the experience of being Trump's ghostwriter. And he said that he tried to do the thing that I just described. He tried to sit down with him at length, to interview him about his life. But that Trump, even then, in his early 40s, right, just had a really hard time focusing and sitting still and being able to kind of go through that regular process. And Schwartz, for a while, thought, I won't be able to write this book. I can't get anything. He keeps canceling the meetings or ending them abruptly. So finally, what they decided to do is that he would just kind of follow him around, his workplace and his meetings, and most important, listen in on his phone calls, right? So that gave him a very clear sense of kind of who he was, how he operated, and then he kind of built Art of the Deal around that. So there's lots of different ways to do it. There's a really, for listeners of your show who are more interested in the ghostwriting experience, there's a really good book called Pretend I'm Not Here, which is such a great title for a book about ghostwriting. Pretend I'm Not Here, by a woman named Barbara Todd Feynman, who was a ghostwriter for a lot of prominent political figures, Hillary Clinton, Bob Kerrey, also for some prominent journalists, for Ben Bradley. And it's just a really interesting look at the experience of not just the ghostwriter in general, but the Washington ghostwriter, which is its own unique breed.
Yeah, going back to the her report for Biden, I remember when we were talking with our guest Robert Dietz.
I listened to that episode. That was great. Yeah.
I was like, I kind of feel bad for that writer, because here he is stuck in the middle, and he's deleting files off his computer, because he's like, oh my goodness, Biden had classified whatever, and I was a party to all that. And I mean, in my mind, I created this very sort of comical sort of scenario where where this writer is all of a sudden watching the news and be like, uh-oh, but
well, but anyway. that book has a lot of, Promise Me, Dad, the Biden book, it goes back and forth between dealing with the kind of tragedy of Beau's illness and his, steady deterioration. But also and then suddenly I'm heading to Ukraine, or I'm, dealing with Iraq, or, and so it must have been, interesting to kind of keep those two worlds straight.
Yeah.
And both relied on documents, but in very different ways.
Yeah. So I guess with your level of understanding about Washington, specifically kind of through the pages of the books that have been written or reports written, I'm curious, what do you think is the most misunderstood aspect of Washington's political scene by, the general public at large?
Oh, wow. That's really interesting. Here's one way to think about it, and I'll probably be dreaming up the answer even as I'm spewing words. But so there's one of my favorite books about Washington, or let me rephrase, favorite books about politics, right? Is called The Speechwriter, and it's by this guy named Barton Swaim, who was a speechwriter to Mark Sanford, the South Carolina governor and also congressman. Mark Sanford, who probably became most briefly, notoriously famous for disappearing for a few days and saying he was hiking the Appalachian Trail when in fact he was hooking up with his like Argentine girlfriend, right? And he gave this, meandering, exquisitely awkward press conference, kind of like fessing up to the whole thing when he came back and he was discovered. But Barton Swaim was his speechwriter, and he writes a book about that experience. And one thing he says here, I'm gonna make sure I get it right. I have it here. It's in the introduction to my book as well. He we think that politicians lie all the time, right? There's PolitiFact and there's the Washington Post fact checker, and we count the lies, and that became sort of state of the art during the Trump years in particular. And I think all of that is true and correct and worthwhile. But Swaim reaches a very intriguing conclusion about political rhetoric, and he says, one hears very few proper lies in politics. Using vague, slippery, or just meaningless language is not the same as lying. It's not intended to deceive so much as to preserve options, buy time, distance oneself from others, or just to sound like you're saying something when you're saying nothing, right? Because politicians are asked every day to weigh in on stuff that they have no real thoughts on, no expertise in, and no interest in. And so they have to say something, right? And to me, that idea that a lot of political language, that politics is about subtracting meaning from language, right? About saying nothing while you're pretending to say something. And that to me is a far more sort of interesting and useful way to think about the words politicians use in their speeches and in their books, the way they express themselves, beyond just like, oh, they're a bunch of liars, right? Like that is helpful to me. And I think that my mission, if I have one, is to look at those words that have been drained of meaning and try to put the meaning back in. Right. And for instance, the thing I mentioned about, they're not here to hurt me. They're not here to hurt me. That's like a perfect example of that. Right. Try to think about like, well, what does it mean in either of those cases, depending on how he said what he said. So I think that's a long-winded way of saying that I think political language is far more, even when it sounds awful, it can be incredibly revealing. And therefore is richer than we give it credit for. And frankly, that's why this book exists.
Yeah. When I was reading it there, forgot what chapter it was, but you had mentioned that you became a citizen in like 2014 or something like that. And at the point in which I read that, I was just thinking like, I wish your book would become sort of like necessary reading material for those that want to become citizens.
Oh wow! Thank you.
Because it's like, and this may sound sort of like, I don't know, tongue in cheek, but like in the sense of, I want people to read this and then think to themselves, are you sure this is what you really want to become a part of? Because like our politics is crazy, right? and our politicians are crazy, and like, we do a lot of crazy stuff. I mean, albeit like I still think that we live in a great country, and and I'm being somewhat funny, but also like I feel like if you want a Reader's Digest version of how our politics is ran or run, and the people that are like propagating this craziness, like the Washington book should be required reading. So I'd love to kind of maybe get your take on if you think that would be a good or bad thing. Like my mom's an immigrant. She came here from Vietnam. I can't remember the day or year that she like raised her hand and became a citizen, but I'm very sensitive to folks that actually want to sort of, take the oath, become an American citizen, go through the whole process. But I don't know the first thing about what all that entails. So
yeah. So I'm from Lima, Peru. I came here. I sort of came here twice.
Hmm.
The first time I came here, I was barely a toddler. I was 3 years old, and my family moved to California, in the Bay Area, and we lived there until I was 10 years old. But then we returned to Peru, and we lived there. And for me, it was from like the fifth grade till I finished high school. So I had kind of pretty formative experiences in both places. And then I came back to the U.S. for college. And during this whole time, I'd been a green card holder, and so I never felt the need to become an American citizen. It just seemed like this allows me to live and work here indefinitely, so I'm just going to do that. Um, and but then I got married here. My wife's American. I have three American kids born in Washington D.C. I was like, this is home. I don't know what I'm kind of holding on to, um, to not take this step. So I decided to do it, and I did it in 2014. It was too late in the year to be able to vote in the midterm election in 2014. So my first election as a voter was 2016. Was Clinton
Wow.
versus Trump, and my experience as a book critic also started around that time. Started in early 2015, and so for me the imperatives of sort of reading and understanding politics through books and of citizenship are really bound together. I see reading about politics, writing about politics, thinking about the American experiment writ large, as completely intertwined with my experience as an American citizen. I think the moment where I mentioned that in the book is when I'm writing about Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, which I wrote about as a wonderful book to read as a new American citizen. I read it during my first year as an American citizen. I would not put myself up with Alexis de Tocqueville, but if anyone who's joining this crazy place as a citizen wants to read a second book after Democracy in America, I would be thrilled if they pick up the Washington book.
That's awesome. Good. What's your favorite story in the book? Your favorite summary or essay?
The I mean, there's a lot of little anecdotes that I find just irresistible in these books, and that's the beauty. Like you may find in another. So James Comey's memoir, right, the former FBI director. It is not an exciting book to read. He's not a very sympathetic figure. But the one thing I remember most from that book is just one anecdote. When before he was FBI director, he's briefing George W. Bush in the White House, and it's a cold winter day. It's like snowy outside, and he's giving some important briefing to the president. And at one point, George W. Bush raises his hand just to signal for him to stop, and he walks over to the window, looks out on the south lawn, sees. He walked over because he heard that like Marine One, the helicopter, right, is arriving to kind of pick him up or something, and he watches the force of the propellers blow snow all over the press corps, right, and he just watches it, looks at it out the window, and then sits back down and says, "Okay, keep going." Like he just wanted to watch journalists get covered in snow. And then he continues the briefing, right? There's moments like that are just so, not just funny, but so human, right? It was like a little way that George W. Bush could get revenge. That like, that's the thing I'm going to remember from Jim Comey's memoir, A Higher Loyalty, right? Is it the most significant thing in the book? No. But it tells you something about a president's relationship with the press that a million thoughtful, erudite essays about, media, presidential relations will not capture. But it is captured there. So hopefully in just about every essay, there's something like that just gives you a little window into Washington life.
That's so funny. Okay, so my last question. So this, this book is coming out at a time. Um, Political climate in the U.S. is pretty charged, divisive. We got Super Tuesday coming up in just a
Hmm.
couple weeks. How do you hope your book will impact readers' understanding of like the Washington political climate or political culture?
Yeah. Um, I hope it humanizes it a little bit. I hope we start thinking of individuals, of people, as much as we think about these immovable forces of populism or a liberalism, the left and the right. It's easy to get caught up in that kind of um, abstraction of popular debate. And in the end, these are stories about how people are trying to present themselves, right? And so for me, that's the um, uh, that's a useful lens. I once It's not the only lens. A colleague of mine at the New York Times wrote a wonderful book called Audience of One. It was trying to understand Trump, say through television, right? And that's a perfectly legitimate way to explore politics in our time. For me, it's through books, right? And through the words that politicians use. One of the essays in the book focuses on one word that Joe Biden uses again and again, and that is the word still, right? America is still a democracy. We are still a beacon of freedom. It's never been a good bet to bet against America, and it still isn't, right? It could just be a rhetorical flourish, but what does still tell you, right? Still tells you that there's an argument going on, right? America is a democracy is a statement of belief. America is still a democracy acknowledges that there's an argument going on. And that is the way in which I understand Joe Biden. And it props up against it juts up against Trump's use of the word again, right? Make America great again. Again is the whole thing, right? Again is everything, right? Still is about how we're trying to hold on to something that we think we still can be. Again is about something we lost that we're trying to get back, right? It's hope versus nostalgia, right? And simply by honing in on those two words, to my mind, you can really capture what this campaign might be about. So I hope that people, when if they encounter this book, will just think a little bit differently about um, the words politicians use and may listen with a slightly different ear when they're hearing speeches or when they're reading these books.
Oh, that's really awesome. I was going to ask you where can people find your book, but I'm guessing that if people are smart enough to get to a podcast, they probably know where to find your book. So I'm actually going to just change my last question
Sure.
a little bit, and like what books are you looking forward to reading? Like I'm assuming Biden may write a memoir or something like that, but
Mm, yeah.
what books that are probably going to be published in the future are you looking to read?
Um, you know, I'm looking forward to reading Anthony Fauci's memoir that he has coming out this summer. Um, because not only because he's had sort of a long and fascinating career in life in Washington, but because he's become one of the most polarizing figures in recent years due to the COVID response. And so it's interesting. It's interesting to me how a man of science, um, but also one who's immersed in the political world,
Yeah.
navigates that tension. Um, I mean, everyone just saw Oppenheimer. That is Oppenheimer, the movie, and American Prometheus, the book it's based on, are books about the relationship between politics and science, between
Hmm.
government and scientists, and that is a fascinating um, tension that I hope will come alive in Fauci's book. Um, I think Antony Blinken, Biden's current Secretary of Defense, I mean, excuse me, Secretary of State,
Hmm.
um, uh, has had a very interesting tenure, and I hope that he writes about it at some point. From the Trump presidency, I would love to read a memoir from Kirsten Nielsen, who was the Secretary of Homeland Security, who had a very difficult go of it. I was involved in some of the most controversial policies of the administration, and I would love to hear her version of events. So those are some. But really, the Washington books that I end up loving are the ones that like came out of nowhere that I wasn't expecting, and suddenly reveal so much. But those of kind of some major figures, those are some that I'd be interested in hearing from in book form.
That's really cool. Well, how can people kind of keep up with the work you're doing, both at the New York Times and any sort of future books that you may have on your plate?
Oh, sure. I write for the New York Times opinion section. I have a podcast called Matter of Opinion with 3 of my colleagues in opinion, where we sort of debate a lot of kind of big questions of the day. I often find myself kind of testing out ideas on the podcast, and then depending on whether I think they made sense and what kind of reaction I got from my colleagues or from listeners, that might develop into a column. And then those columns might develop into books. So I hope to be. So I wrote a book about the books of the Trump era. If you think of them as like those Russian nesting dolls, I think that book is sort of a subset of the Washington book, which spans a much larger time period. But I hope to keep expanding that circle. And something I'd like to do next is a book about sort of the big ideas about America, almost the catchphrases, right? The nation of immigrants, the shining city, the American dream, the land of opportunity, the frontier nation, right? And try to sort of understand each of those ideas through books and essays as well.
Oh wow, that would be pretty incredible. Well, I look forward to reading your future works, and I appreciate you spending some time with us, Carlos. This has been amazing.
Thank you so much. A real delight.
And to our Faithful Politics listeners and viewers, thanks for joining us. And as always, keep your conversations not left or right, but up. And we'll see you next time. Take care.